Hello, and welcome to another episode of Boundless Body Radio. I'm your host, Casey Ruff, and today we have two amazing guests to introduce to you now. Dom and Sheila D'Agostino, both of whom are Ph.D.s, make a true power couple. Dominic D'Agostino, Ph.D., has maintained involvement in a vast array of professional, academic, and personal endeavors related to ketone research. As an associate professor with tenure at the University of South Florida, Don teaches students of the Morsani College of Medicine and the Department of Molecular Pharmacology and Physiology with a focus on such topics as medical biochemistry, physiology, neuroscience, and neuropharmacology. The primary focus of his work is the human state of ketosis, ketogenesis, and developing and testing metabolic-based therapies, including dietary therapies, nutritional supplements, and a variety of metabolic-based drugs. Sheila D'Agostino, Ph.D., is a neuroscientist with a passion to better understand how our brain works and how we can improve its health and functions. As a research assistant professor at the University of South Florida, she has been studying metabolic therapies for the last 12 years. She is the founder of Audacious Nutrition, and her amazing ketone supplements, starting with her Keto Start products, were successfully launched in July of 2021. Dom and Sheila D'Agostino, what an honor it is to welcome you to Boundless Body Radio.
Great to be here, Casey. Thank you for having me. And yeah, my wife may or may not join. She's out with the animals on the farm right now, so we'll see. We had some severe weather come through, so she's kind of tied up, but we'll see if she can. If she can't make it on, she can
Hey,
just later. Yeah.
yeah, if she jumps on, absolutely awesome. It was so cool to meet
Yep.
both of you in San Diego. If she doesn't jump on, we'll host the two of you again or host her again. Decided to keep her in the introduction, which was full of massive words, which just speaks to how smart both of you are. Like, I think I probably would have been overwhelmed if both of you were on the same episode with just too much IQ. You know what I mean? Coming at me.
Well, hers is double mine, so yeah, so she makes she helps, balance me out because sometimes she keeps me in line. I'll say that. So when it comes to different ideas and vetting out science and, help, working on publications and designing experiments. And she was a huge help running the NASA Extreme Environment Mission Operations, where it was really her initiative to do like 5 IRB protocols worth of human research on that project. So I just wanted to do one, but she's a very audacious thinker, and I think that lends itself to her company, Audacious Nutrition. So,
The name definitely fits. And I was just playing
yeah.
around on the website. The website is so well done. And I would contend that
Oh,
even if you
thanks.
weren't in the market to buy exogenous ketones or try her products, you could learn a vast amount about ketones and ketogenesis and all this amazing stuff. And
Yeah.
I was sitting there scrolling through all the pages and how awesome everything is laid out and how everything's explained. And I was thinking to myself, I'll bet the two of them, this probably took them like an hour and a half to do. I'm sure it was like just like a quick afternoon. Let's put together ketone information that's absolutely amazing. And you just like threw up everything you guys already knew. And that made an amazing website.
I'll be 100% honest. I did not even really look at it until she finished it. I was so busy with her. Yeah, that was 100% her. She was very passionate because, we do research and there are a variety of different formulations out there, and ketone salts were out there, and they were not tolerable, they were not palatable, and they were not potent. So she took the initiative to figure out the electrolyte ratios, which is very, very similar to Element, the LMNT supplement. So that ratio works in regards to GI tolerability and also palatability. And then the electrolytes are bound ionically to beta hydroxybutyrate, which is a ketone. And it was really her getting all the raw ingredients. And then me as a bystander, she would just give me things and not even tell me like what they were. And I would test them, give her blood work, give her information on palatability, and then we would vet it out through. She's got a lot of business mentors and people in the fitness industry, but it took like, I mean, she started, it took like 3 years to really get it up, get the product, because I'm not very entrepreneurial, but she has a very strong, she's a scientist, but also has this entrepreneurial spirit that's equally as high. So she took the reins on that and built the website out herself and everything. So
Yeah, oh, that's amazing.
Yeah.
My wife is also a personal trainer, and she does amazing work with Pilates and does a lot of tissue release. And for me,
Yeah.
it's I feel partial. You know what I mean? Like I feel like she
Yeah.
does amazing work, and I want to tell people she does amazing work, but it always feels like kind of like I'm taking her side, obviously. And I wonder if it's the same for you. But I read on the website that like as you have been at this for so long, you've tested so many salts and esters and so many other things. Speak to the quality of the product that she's making. I mean, is it the best quality product that you've ever seen or tested, not only in the market, but whatever is available to you for research?
Yeah, yeah, it is. So there are different ketone products that you could buy out there, and there are ketone esters. And I would say I have them behind me and or around. The ketone esters are not very palatable, but they are more potent in regards to their ability to elevate ketones into a level that you could only achieve through like long-term fasting. We're talking like 7 to 10 days of fasting. uh, but what we found in our research is that higher is not better. So just like, high glucose is not better than low glucose, you actually start to get energy toxicity. So once your ketones get high and your body has to deal with that energetic burden, and then you're using energy and organ stress to eliminate and bring down the ketone levels, and ketones are acidic. So this is important from the context of the everyday person using exogenous ketones. You don't want to in our world of CNS oxygen toxicity, military things, traumatic brain injury, in the context of acute therapeutics and also very extreme environments like hypobaric environments, undersea, you may want to get up to 2, 3, 4 millimolar of ketones, but the average person really does not want to get above 1 millimolar for 99.9% of applications, right? So, so you have different options to do that. You could use 1,3-butanediol, which actually does put some stress on the liver to convert into beta-hydroxybutyrate. That's being sold by different companies and is actually the vast majority of ketones that are being sold is 1,3-butanediol. It's like dirt cheap, and your body can make ketones out of it, but it doesn't taste very good and it's in a liquid form. And then you have ketone esters, and there's a couple different companies. We talked about that. And then the best option and I've tinkered with all these things for so long. I mean, what I use personally is an electrolyte beta hydroxybutyrate formulation, which is a ketone salt, right? And the vast majority of ketone salts on the market, when you consume them, a lot of them will go right through you. They do taste a little bit better, but absorption is a problem. And it could be the potassium, it's likely the magnesium, BHB. So you really have to design and engineer an electrolyte formulation that works good. And I think that was part of like what my wife probably had to spend the most time on, because the original formulations, I was like, nope, nope, this sent me to the bathroom. Go back. So it was like tweaking for years to get something where I could get up to 1 or 2 millimolar and get into a good range and then deliver, electrolytes and ketones at the same time and have it. And then it's like a whole thing. Well, how do you flavor it? These things taste nasty. So you have to use like very like natural agents that can mask the taste. So you coat it in various you know natural substances that can be a carrier agent, and then sweetening too. I mean, there's artificial sweeteners out there that most people use, even things like erythritol. But I think my wife was really adamant on using monk fruit, just because the glycemic, the taste had a good profile and things like that. She didn't want to use erythritol or sucralose or aspartame, of course, things like that. So,
Wow.
but yeah, the final product, it was vetted out, and it is kind of like it's a simple product. It's got a very short a very short ingredient list, right? It's like electrolytes that are bound to beta hydroxybutyrate and monk fruit, and then like a natural flavoring agent that makes it taste like raspberry lemonade or a fruit punch.
Wow. Wow, that's amazing.
Yeah,
Yeah, I just based on that, you can tell what a tremendous amount of work that must have been to be able to put that together. That's absolutely amazing. I do
yeah,
want to talk to you about ketones and supplementation. Who should be taking exogenous? Who could be thinking about that? I think we're learning more and more about the cycling teams that are buying them up in
yeah.
preparation for races like the Tour de France. I know you guys have had application in ice hockey. Those are two of my favorite sports anyway, so
Mhm.
that's all amazing. So let's come back to that, but we do have to point out to the listener, obviously, if you haven't come across Dom's work, you've been living under a rock. This is not a person that just found the keto diet and put out a cookbook like last year and started an Instagram page. You have been into this for a very long time. I remember when I first started getting into this, it was some of your content and your interviews and podcasts that I came across that really helped me understand what the hell any of this was. So for the listener, can you tell them who you are and how you got interested in researching ketones?
Yeah, it was kind of like a slow process. Background in nutrition and biology, and I was always interested in different types of diets, even clinically. That's why I went to a nutrition science program, registered dietitian program, but I didn't do the clinical aspect and just double majored in biology. Then I went into neuroscience and got very interested in brain energy metabolism as it relates to extreme environments. And my primary focus was actually really on lactate. I wanted to see use lactate in the context of hypoxic brain injury to like re-energize. And I'm still interested in that and still, tinkering with things in the lab on that front. But then, as I was funded by the Office of Navy Research to be able to predict and mitigate central nervous system oxygen toxicity, which manifests as a grand mal seizure or tonic-clonic seizure. And in the process of exploring different mitigation strategies to enhance the warfighter, and oxygen toxicity is the main limitation for Navy SEALs that use a closed circuit rebreather. So it was kind of serving that aspect of our military, special operations community. I was mostly focused on drugs and various like supplements, antioxidant formulations, and things like that. And then this idea that the therapeutic ketosis worked remarkably well for seizures independent of the etiology, which means like you put someone on a ketogenic diet, you put them into therapeutic ketosis, and then it works for Lennox-Gastaut syndrome, temporal lobe epilepsy, all different types of seizures. So uh, my original idea was to use the ketogenic diet. The military said, well, come up with the ketogenic diet in a pill. So I think it was like 2007 or 8 that I, started tinkering with different formulations that could induce and sustain what we call therapeutic ketosis, which is the rapid elevation of ketones in the blood and to the brain, and to sustain that for a period of time that would be the duration of a Navy SEAL operation, or military procedure. So that sent me on a cascade of, experimenting with a bunch of different molecules. And actually, the beta hydroxybutyrate monoester did not work in our hands. So it actually sent us down the road to look at various formulations that elevate beta hydroxybutyrate and acetoacetate, and we are very agnostic as to like particular companies are kind of like very focused on one formulation that they have a patent to or whatever. So we're a bit different in that we work with dozens of different molecules, and we're just interested in the formulation that works for specific applications. So something that works, for seizures is going to be different than for brain injury, or for cancer or for other things. So we tend to diversify our portfolio of ketogenic agents, based upon the context of what we're studying.
Wow.
That
Well,
could, many different things, even
that
cancer.
wow. Yeah, that's amazing. Well, thank God you took that nutrition course, and studied that, because you must have had class after class after class of this wonderful metabolic state that we can get into as humans, and probably our normal state. I'm sure you guys talk a lot about that in your nutrition education. Is that correct?
Man, like nutrition education is great. It gives you a background, for example, on like vitamin K and what, niacin does and vitamin B6. So uh, it's really like nutritional biochemistry. So I took advanced biochemistry 1 and 2 and advanced nutrition 1 and 2, which were graduate level courses I took as an undergrad, was like advanced biochemistry, but in the context of, for example, micronutrients and, vitamins, minerals. And then, we delved into all the different, nutritional diseases from, beriberi to, kwashiorkor, like, protein deficiency, things like that. So it gives you a good foundation, but we didn't learn anything about low carb diets. There was really no discussion about nutritional therapeutic interventions that could, be used to treat the main problems that we have in the world, which is obesity. It was all about calories in, calories out, which there is a place for that, and that's 80 to 90% of but there was no discussion about different types of diets that could help one achieve satiation and help one achieve, glycemic control and things like that. There was a big stigma towards low carb diets, ketogenic diets. So they were just mentioned kind of in passing as a fad diet. I think, for our neurological, section, we did briefly talk about the ketogenic diet being used as a very last resort for drug refractory pediatric epilepsy. And at the time, in the early 1990s, when I was, in college, there wasn't a whole lot. The ketogenic diet wasn't on people's radar. It was just in the back of a neurology book for pediatric epilepsy.
Yeah. And if you understand history, you understand why like it wasn't that big of a deal in the 90s, but it's kind of interesting to lament that that research is not new. Like we knew 100 years ago the stuff about epilepsy and the stuff about seizures, but again, understanding the history of how we kind of went the
Yeah.
direction of pharmacology, or how a lot of the science that was being done in Germany was kind of lost in translation as things shifted over to America after World War II. But yeah, like I said, it's not like any of this stuff is new. I'm a nutrition coach, which is way low level compared to the research that you've done. And my 600 700 page nutrition book behind me has one sentence that even mentions ketogenesis happens when you burn fat. So kind of sad that the information isn't out there. You had this really amazing opportunity to do so much research in so many different fields. You mentioned Navy SEALs. What have been some of your favorite things to work on if you look back on your career and all the amazing opportunities you've had to do research around ketogenic diet for many different applications?
Yeah, good question. We're motivated by translational research. So a lot of research is done from like the bottom up, which means like you identify a mechanism and then work on that mechanism and try to figure out, a therapeutic strategy to employ whatever molecule you develop or, method you develop for particular disorders, right? So we were of the opinion it's like we knew the ketogenic diet worked and it worked remarkably well in the context of very powerful seizures. So then the question came out, well, how is it actually preventing the brain from going into a seizure? So it's doing that through a lot of different mechanisms working in synergy. So it's providing the brain a source of energy that the brain can maintain ATP levels even in the context of oxidative stress, which in this case is very, very high levels of oxygen that make a big burst of oxygen free radicals or reactive oxygen species. So there's that, but it's also has an anti-inflammatory effect. It has like epigenetic effects, which I have a PhD student studying right now. It changes the neuropharmacology of the brain, and it allows the brain by altering different enzymatic systems, including glutamic acid decarboxylase, which is an enzyme that converts glutamate to GABA. It can shift the pharmacology of the brain. So as we started studying the diet, then we started applying it to different applications that could be genetic disorders like Angelman syndrome to inborn errors of metabolism, like glucose transporter type 1 deficiency syndrome. And then I had a PhD student come along who's Dr. Angela Poff, and she's my co-host for the Metabolic Health Summit. Uh,
Amazing.
And, she had an interest in cancer. So we started studying this and we've published about a half dozen, articles on and, peer-reviewed science on using therapeutic ketosis as a means to reduce the growth and spread of cancer, metastatic cancer. And I think it has the best application for brain cancer because you have the dual use of it controlling the seizures associated with brain cancer, but also it inhibits it hits a variety of different mechanisms from suppressing insulin, elevating ketones, which have anti-cancer effect, to lowering glucose availability, to reducing inflammation, to having epigenetic effects that can alter gene expression and have anti-cancer effects through that mechanism. So it's working through many different mechanisms in synergy. And so I think the cancer stuff really surprised me because as I got into this, I was laser focused on the primary application of ketosis, the accepted application, which is seizures. And then it brought us down into different areas of science, including cancer biology and even the metabolic control of epigenetic regulation, which we're really delving into now. Uh, and I do believe that there's so much that we can learn from not only ketones as an energy metabolite, but ketones being produced in ways that alter specific enzymes that impact our gene expression and are called histone deacetylase enzymes, right? So they can alter different histone deacetylase enzymes, but the ketones can also directly impact gene expression by interacting with the histone, which actually plays a big role in gene expression. And I know that's getting way down into the weeds, but I think it's opening up a whole new area of science that I thought I otherwise would not get into. And I have to actually go back to my molecular biology books because my students are molecular biologists by undergraduate training, and I have to go back and to my old textbooks to just or new textbooks to keep up with
Wow.
some of the new science that's coming out on this. So that has been fun, and it kind of lends itself to this idea that if you get into a state of therapeutic ketosis, you can change your gene expression. That we are not, we're not kind of a slave to our genome, and that we can alter our metabolic physiology to impact gene expression in ways that have favorable health outcomes. And that could be from a cardiovascular, from age-related dementia to even to have anti-cancer effects through impacting gene expression. And I think this is a very rapid emerging area of science. And I think the metabolic control of epigenetic regulation, we're at the cusp of understanding how these metabolites, and probably not just ketones, it's lactate, it's various intermediates can really profoundly alter, and even pharmaceutical companies are looking at some of these metabolites and then trying to kind of like reverse engineer molecules that could be epigenetic regulators and that could be used for cancer therapies and for different disorders. So that has been very exciting because it keeps me like right on the edge, the bleeding edge of the latest molecular biology. And I have to work hard to really keep up with the science.
That's amazing. Yeah. Well, I think that's so empowering for people to hear that they aren't, doomed to whatever their genes say. Like we just hosted Pablo Kelly. He's had glioblastoma for
Oh yeah, yeah,
almost 10
yeah,
years. What an amazing story. He decided not to
yeah,
do traditional therapies. He's still around. He's still able to talk to us. Like very, very
yeah.
cool. And I think I remember you telling this story. Some of this kind of became a little bit more clear to you because you were using cancer cells in petri dish with different metabolites and noticing something interesting was happening with the cancer cells. And I believe it was beta hydroxybutyrate, correct? That you were
Yeah.
not necessarily expecting.
Yeah, yeah. I think going back to my early studies, and I have to think about the dates. I think it was like 2007 or 8, where we had cancer cells, U87 MG cells, which are like a glioblastoma cell line. I think originally derived from like a 44-year-old glioblastoma patient, right? And I had them back from my postdoctoral fellowship in Ohio and brought them down to Florida, where I was doing my postdoctoral training. And I had access to medical students who wanted to do some research. So I would grow them in culture in petri dishes, and I would have the medical students do little projects, and they didn't really know what they were giving them. Like I didn't tell them. I was like, give them molecule, this molecule X and molecule Z or whatever, and treat them at different concentrations. And we were using some molecules that were, I want to actually revisit, like 2-deoxyglucose and lonidamine, and they're glycolytic inhibitors. And then we started, I was focused on that first, but then actually got beta hydroxybutyrate and started growing the cancer cells in the absence and the presence of the ketone beta hydroxybutyrate at levels that we could achieve with the ketogenic diet or supplementation. And noticed that the cancer cells were not growing as well, and it was decreasing their proliferation. We would do like a proliferation assay. And then it was also, we did a live cell death assay, and we noticed there were less live cells and more dead cells when we grew these cancer cells in the presence of ketones, and we kept glucose normal. So we didn't even like alter the glucose levels. So that was one observation. And we also we grew like human fibroblasts and neurons, and then we would lower the glucose and elevate the ketones. And in that context, the brain cancer cells and the human dermal fibroblasts were perfectly happy and healthy. But when we lowered the glucose and elevated the ketones in cancer cells, like all the cancer cells died. So this was like a visual representation of kind of what was going on, that there was, that cancer cells could not survive in the absence of glucose or the lowering of glucose. So we kept it just at a low level. And that the cancer cells really lack the metabolic flexibility to transition from using glucose to using to using ketones. So they had a very high glycolytic need for growth and repair. So the cancer cells use glucose for energy, but they also use it to expand, to basically as to make to for the expanding biomass of the tumor. So as the cells divide, the glucose is shuttled into, for example, lipids. So you have to make a lot of membrane, as cells are dividing and replicating. And a large majority of the glucose actually goes towards that. It's also used for energy. So the ketones, some cancer cells can use ketones. If you do tracer studies, which called tracer studies, you can actually see that the carbons from the ketones can be used in the expanding biomass of the tumor. But if you have a very aggressive cancer line, they have altered mitochondria, and it's altered in a way, there's structural and functional alterations in the mitochondria that prevent the cancer cells from efficiently using ketones as an energy source. But they can use them for biosynthetic processes. And that's where there's a lot of like a bit of confusion that, I get asked the questions, can cancer cells use ketones? And I think that the large majority of cancer cells can actually probably use it for energetic processes, but it's not a very efficient fuel. But they can be shuttled into lipid biosynthesis to contribute to the expanding biomass of the tumor. So that could be acknowledged. But from my understanding, there are no cancer cells. If you subtract glucose and glutamine, it'll essentially kill all cancer cells. I don't think any cancer cells can survive if you lower glucose and glutamine. Whereas, we work with a variety of different cell lines, smooth muscle cells, human dermal fibroblast cell, like a variety of different cell lines do remarkably well if you dramatically lower glucose and glutamine, and they do really well. But cancer cells will quickly die. I mean, this is pretty much any cancer cell you look at. And that's something that cancer biologists are not focusing enough on. And I think a lot more time, energy, and experimentation needs to be directed towards metabolically managing cancer from the context of using glycolytic inhibitors and inhibiting glutamine metabolism or glutaminolysis in tumors. I think there's tremendous potential to strategically metabolically inhibit, and that may not be, it's probably not a standalone therapy to use it, but it could further augment the therapeutic efficacy of the standard of care. That could be radiation, chemo, And even immune-based therapies like checkpoint inhibitors, I think there's great synergy with therapeutic ketosis and targeting glutamine, for example, with PD-1 inhibitors.
Interesting. Yeah, well, I would love to see that research done as well. But it's like Dr. Thomas Seyfried told us on the show, like cancer is a revenue creating disease. And so it's going to be hard to be really motivated to fund some of this research, right? Like that's going to be tough.
Yeah, that is true. And you do see that, he brought that up early on. We started communicating well over a decade ago. And there's a lot of truth to that, but there's also truth to like, working with different cancer organizations that are funded by pharma, and even we collaborate with the Moffitt Cancer Center here, and it is a cancer industry. I mean, it makes money. It exists because of the standard of care that's being utilized, and many cancers do respond remarkably well to the standard of care, especially and so Tom Seifert and our lab focus on cancers that are essentially resistant to the standard of care. So that would include glioblastoma, even low-grade glioma, and stage 4 metastatic cancer. It's like, the standard of care doesn't work for them. So we focus all our time and energy on advanced aggressive brain cancer models and also metastatic cancer. There are many scientists who study cancer and or different tumors like patient-derived xenografts, for example, or cancer cells in a petri dish. But all cancer researchers should really be studying metastatic cancer, and very few cancer researchers study metastatic cancer because you don't die of a tumor, unless it's a brain tumor. But even in that case, you got metastasis and it infiltrates different areas, so it spreads. But I think the large majority of cancer research should really be focused on developing really good models of metastatic cancer. And Thomas Seyfried has one of the best models of metastatic cancer that I know of, which is the VMM3 model of metastatic cancer. It made like the front cover of the International Journal of Cancer like over a decade ago.
Wow.
In our hands, I mean, this is like the most deadly, fast, aggressive cancer that you could see. Like you inject the cancer cells into the flank, and then there's rapid spread and metastasis to the brain, to the liver. The liver is like peppered with all these metastatic lesions. It's just like this deadly form of cancer. So it represented to us a great model for us to test the ketogenic diet, and also we've never studied the ketogenic diet as a standalone. So even from right out of the gate, we combine the ketogenic diet with hyperbaric oxygen therapy. So in the context of high pressure oxygen delivered 3 times a week, 2.5 atmospheres for 60 to 90 minutes, you hyperoxygenate the tumor. That massively increases reactive oxygen species. And then in the context of a tumor, you have a lot of free iron. It drives the Fenton reaction. So you have more oxidative stress that's cancer specific, right? So that is a strategy I think needs to be really employed, and that even in the context of radiation, the efficacy of radiation is proportional to the PO2 of the tumor. So you could utilize oxygen with radiation, and some people are doing that. So there's just so much to unpack, and I guess when you think about it, ketogenic diets, diet therapies, hyperbaric oxygen, it is difficult for cancer treatment centers and research centers to make money off this. So, but we are equally interested in small molecules and various cancer drugs because I think there's equally, they could be equally efficacious or more efficacious for managing cancer. And I think they synergize well with a ketogenic diet. The ketogenic diet can enhance your cancer specific immunity. It could help your immune system recognize cancer. It can decrease side effects. It can help the patient throughout their therapy by decreasing side effects. And we think that if you titrate the protein and elevate ketones and sustain ketones, that ketones have an anti-catabolic effect. I mean, from an evolutionary perspective, if we didn't make ketones, we would massively, our skeletal muscle wasting would be so rapid, we would die from muscle wasting, you know. So elevating and sustaining ketone levels throughout cancer therapy, you have the anti-tumor effects, the anti-inflammatory effects, and then the ketones have well-defined anti-catabolic effects. So it helps your body, it lowers the level of alanine. So when we break down muscle, you release a lot of gluconeogenic amino acids like alanine, and these go down. The branch chain amino acids are preserved. So there are very real, you know, benefits to being in therapeutic ketosis throughout standard of care therapies. So I think that needs to be acknowledged and needs to be studied.
Fascinating. No, I absolutely love that. Maybe this is a bit late in the episode to ask you. We're 35 minutes in. Maybe it's a little late for this question, but can you explain what are ketones? Where do they
Oh
come
yeah.
from?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I probably should do that out of the gate, but
My bad.
people can people can rewind this and start back. But
Exactly.
ketone bodies, we call them ketone bodies because they're named by a physiologist. So there's beta hydroxybutyrate, which is technically not chemically a ketone, but let's call it a ketone body, and acetoacetate. And then there's also acetone, which you can measure in the breast. And then acetone is very interesting. I'm not going to go down that rabbit hole, but I think it has some interesting signaling properties that we're looking at, maybe even epigenetic effects. But you have your ketones are elevated in the blood, urine, and breath when our bodies are burning very high levels of fatty acids for fuel. So that typically happens in the context of being in an energy deficit, a calorie deficit, which could be from intermittent fasting to starvation, or conversely to just simple carbohydrate restriction, which decreases glycogen content in the liver. And you have various processes in the liver that the liver is like an energetic sensor. And when glycogen levels are low, insulin will be low, glucagon will be high, catecholamines like adrenaline will be high. This will help to mobilize fatty acids for fuel. Uh, Fatty acids are very efficient fuel for skeletal muscle, for the heart, and even for the organs to some extent. But the brain cannot really use in sufficient quantities fat as an energy source. So beta oxidation of fatty acids in the liver creates an overproduction of acetyl-CoA, which is diverted down a pathway that's called ketogenesis. And then you have two acetoacetate molecules condensed to form, or two acetyl-CoA molecules condensed to form acetoacetate, and there's an enzymatic conversion to beta hydroxybutyrate. And in circulation, there's about a 4-to-1 or a 3-to-1 ratio of beta hydroxybutyrate to acetoacetate in the blood. And both of these ketone bodies are like water soluble fat molecules that can readily cross the blood-brain barrier and preserve and maintain brain energy metabolism in the context of fasting, starvation, or extreme carbohydrate restriction. And then we can also make glucose from the glycerol backbone of the triglyceride, and we can make glucose from gluconeogenic amino acids. So there's very powerful homeostatic mechanisms that maintain our blood glucose. So glucose levels may fall, but they'll typically stay in the range of 3, maybe even 4 millimolar, even in the context of fasting or like a zero carbohydrate intake. But what's really important about therapeutic ketosis is the elevation and sustainment of ketones in the blood and in the urine and the breath as they can be measured. And these have important signaling properties, and they're also just like a marker for, the elevation of ketones is also more or less a marker for a suppression of insulin signaling and enhanced fatty acid oxidation. Uh, and I was very skeptical of this idea of just simply drinking ketones and elevating ketones independent of carbohydrate restriction or anything. I was like, this is not going to work. But then I started talking to like people that were very smart in the field, like Dr. Richard Veach, who trained under Hans Krebs of the Krebs cycle, and he had built an NIH-funded lab studying metabolism of ketones. And Theodore Van Italy Dr. George Cahill, Dr. Sammy Hash. I started speaking to all these people that were super smart, and they convinced me that the ketones, that the body can readily use ketones, we can consume them through exogenous molecules, and that it could potentially be a fruitful path to go down. And I did, and it's surprised. Well, right out of the gate, the first molecules we tested had no effect on seizures at all. So I lost enthusiasm. And then I connected with Dr. Henri Brunengraber, who was at Case Western, and he ran the NIH-funded metabolomics score at Case Western. And he uh, kindly gave me the synthesis protocol to synthesize 1,3-butanediol acetoacetate diester. So that's a long name for a molecule that when you consume it, it elevates beta hydroxybutyrate and acetoacetate more or less in a 1-to-1 ratio. And then that was like a miracle molecule for preventing seizures from oxygen toxicity and other types of seizures. So it gave me like a renewed appreciation. And all this was happening within about 3 or 4 months of one another. We were testing different agents, some worked, some didn't. And then we found one that worked. And then I quickly realized that this could be a whole career path for me. Like I could carve out a career of developing and testing exogenous ketogenic agents for a wide range of neurological disorders. As a neuroscientist, that was my like focus. But then I had students and people that wanted to look at cancer, and there seemed to be some promising effects in our cell culture. So we moved that to animal model systems where it worked remarkably well.
That's incredible. I absolutely love that. You mentioned gluconeogenesis, and a lot of people throw that around like it's a swear word. And I
Yeah.
certainly think it could be if you're running in a carbohydrate fed state. But you also mentioned George Cahill, who's the author of my absolute favorite study ever done, 40 days fasted. And he showed how the body adapts. And you see that
Yeah.
line after the body burns off its stored glycogen, all the glucose it has in it, then the stored glycogen, you see the gluconeogenesis line creep up, but then it starts to drop and level out at a low level
Yeah.
for the remainder of the study because the body is adapting to using fat and ketones as fuel and doesn't really need a lot of gluconeogenesis. It can just provide that low level, perfect amount that you need at any given time. And you don't see people just like wasting away, like people talk about with gluconeogenesis, like you're going to burn muscle. Like, no, you're not, as long as you're in this type of a metabolic state. I never see it.
Yeah. Yeah, you're not. And especially if you are following a ketogenic diet, I mean, if you're in a starvation state, you're you're running a calorie deficit, and your metabolism will start to decrease over time. Like when I, fasted for a week or more, my body temperature went down, active T3 goes down, catecholamines go down, heart rate kind of goes up in the beginning because your stress hormones are kicked up, like cortisol and adrenaline and things like that. And then, and after about 3 to 4 days, you just start feeling like very calm, almost like nothing can bother. By the fifth day, it felt like I took a high dose of a beta blocker, like, which back in the day I would take that before like my PhD dissertation defense or something like that. I remember taking like the first time I took like a beta blocker, I needed it. Like you're just super chill, you're super relaxed, and also you're kind of like more in a Zen state. But also like you start to get cold, like, whereas a ketogenic diet is different because you're in a eucaloric state. So you're not in an energy deficit, you're not in a calorie surplus when it's implemented clinically. And your ketones are elevated and your glucose goes down and your insulin is almost like sub clinical, like actually like in kids. And even for me, I was like 2.2, after following a clinical ketogenic diet. And now I have some carbohydrates back into my diet, typically in the form of like, stuff that grows on my property, like avocados, or we have some mango trees, and blueberries, like wild blueberries I eat, some broccoli here and there. But it's almost, it's I'm not, that probably doesn't contribute significantly to like muscle glycogen or liver glycogen. I think I don't train a whole lot, maybe like an hour or two max per week, but I do a lot of outside work and walking and things like that. For the athlete that's like super glycolytic and, sprinting and just putting out, 4 to 6 hours of intense physical activity, I think carbohydrates there could be an advantage there for sure. But that's not the large majority of people. And then I think if you are like a CrossFit athlete and you're have a very high output of calories, the amount of carbohydrates that would be optimal is far less than people think. Like we're talking like maybe 300 grams of carbs that are lower glycemic, can top off keeping your body hungry for carbs, keeps that insulin sensitivity up and helps your body better utilize carbs as an energy source. And you're also getting the dual advantage of maximizing your fat oxidation, which can be done in the context of consuming carbohydrates. You just dial your carbs back so your body's always hungry for carbs. And then that can actually maximize your fat oxidation at the same time and keep fat oxidation high. We call
Yeah.
that metabolic flexibility.
Yeah. Yeah, fascinating. The one thing I do have to push back on is the broccoli. I don't know about including broccoli in the diet, dude. I'm not sure about that.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I can
Well,
say
I
like,
had people challenge me. I posted something and then someone was like, the broccoli is killing you, you have, oxalates and all these. So it's like, show me one study that broccoli is doing anything negative to your body. So actually, I just kind of use it as more like a garnish. My dogs do really well. I clip off like the florets and just like the really green part, and I have a little bit of that, and then the fibrous part I actually mix up with my dog's food, which is like ketogenic, high fat, high protein. And that I do notice that extra fiber helps them poop a lot better. So, and I do notice that if I don't do that at all, they will nibble on the grasses around the
yeah,
farm. I don't know what that means. I don't think it's pathological in any way, shape, or form. Just think that that's what dogs do. And if a dog's going to kill an animal, it's going to go for the stomach and an herbivorous animal, it's going to eat the contents of the gut, and it's kind of normal in that. But our dogs eat raw meat, liver, eggs, and like a sprinkle of some broccoli fiber here and there,
yeah,
and then
great.
they're super helpful. I just got all the blood work back from my dogs and it like looks awesome. So our
Nice.
dogs get blood work too, so
That's great.
yeah.
We've had a vet on our show who was reversing type 2 diabetes in cats by feeding them a carnivorous diet. But he explained that dogs are different. They do need some plant
Oh,
material. And I've observed that
yeah.
with my dogs. It seems once a week they start like chewing on grass. And I don't
Yeah.
know anything about that either, but I think that's also very interesting. And that could very
Yeah.
well explain that for sure. And I'll just
Well,
say too, like
cats are like obligate carnivores.
obligate.
So yeah, they need it. I mean, they will die. They need like taurine, like you know, uh cats, if you the worst thing you could do for a cat is like feed them anything other than meat because
Yeah.
they should not be like there should be no vegan cats. That's actually, I mean, that's something PETA should attack people who are feeding their cats like a vegetarian or a vegan diet. Whereas dogs have more of a mixed palate and more omnivorous, largely carnivorous, but dogs are remarkably adaptable to different diets relative to cats. So cats will quickly become insulin resistant, obese,
Yeah.
if you start feeding them corn, kibble,
Yeah.
things like that. Yeah.
Yeah, he said just like the cheapest wet cat food that's mostly or all meat is the best thing for a cat.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
believe the term for a dog is facultative carnivore, so it's like mostly, like you said,
Yeah.
it's pretty much like us. I've heard that since we basically created dogs through selective kind of breeding over 30,000 years, they have the most similar digestive system to us, and so
Yeah.
we are omnivore, and so are they. It should lean mostly towards meat, but yeah, very interesting. Very interesting. So okay, so I can identify two different times in the last week that I had my heart rate up very, very high. 6,500 feet mountain biking up the last like kind of steep little pitch. My heart rate got up to 190. Yesterday, I was on the ice playing ice hockey with my buds. My heart rate got very elevated there. And I will say that, I've been carnivore for 4.5 years. I will say that at those like kind of peaks of anaerobic activity, I can say I probably lost about 5%. Like it's not quite as good as it would have been when I was eating more of a mixed diet before, but I just feel so much better through the rest of my life. I'm okay to take 15 seconds out of my shift on hockey and get off a little bit early. That's not a big deal for me to not experience tons of anxiety and all the stuff I was experiencing before. So that brings me to kind of what you mentioned. Like, yes, an athlete that's doing those high intensity activities, they can bring in more carbohydrates and probably benefit from that. It's pretty, not a lot, but you can bring in some and benefit. But now let's get into like exogenous ketones. Like how can this help athletes, and how are athletes using this to increase their performance?
Yeah, I don't think there's really any major bottleneck for ketone utilization, but you don't want to, it's like sugar, right? You don't want to give too much and then you create like energy toxicity, right? More
Yeah,
or
yeah.
less, like so that's why a continuous glucose monitor, like I got one on the back of my arm here, Levels Health, plugging them, they're a great company and the app is very insightful. And by using a continuous glucose monitor and the insights that you get through the app allow you to titrate your energy needs to your exercise or your sport or your metabolic health, right? And that's going to be super important. Continuous glucose monitors are way more important for the carbohydrate fueled athlete because that allows you to precisely, dial in your carbs to meet your energetic needs. If you're overshooting outside of like 140, which a lot of people do, if they're just slap on a CGM, they would be able to adjust the amount and the types of carbs to maximize their glycolytic fueling and minimize their hyperinsulin response. But when you're low carb, like you have very little need for that. But I did, realize that once I started introducing a little bit of carbs back in, whether it be fruit, a little bit of sweet potato, something like that, it allowed me to adjust it based upon my energy needs and things like that. For the large part, like right now, I'm ketogenic. I don't think I had any carbohydrates today. I've actually been experimenting with allulose a lot with allulose, and there's a couple products out there I really love. One is RX Sugar, and it's like these little chocolate bars. And allulose is a calorie restriction mimetic. It's a GLP-1 agonist. If you consume allulose, if you consume 50 grams of carbohydrates, you get an insulin rise and a glucose rise. If you consume those carbohydrates with allulose, you get less of an insulin rise and less of a glucose rise. So it attenuates the rise you get from carbohydrates, and we don't know why. So I'm actually fascinated with how is allulose preventing the rise of insulin and glucose from a fixed amount of carbohydrates. So it's like this thing like I'm like reading day and night to figure out what's going on, if it's the microbiome, if it's insulin sensitivity, if it's dialing back gluconeogenesis, which it does seem to be inhibiting some of the enzymes associated with that. So there's so much to learn. And I wouldn't know that if I didn't wear a continuous glucose monitor. So, and you don't have to wear these things like, all year. I do because I'm always testing things. But if you were to wear it like 2 weeks or 4 weeks or something like that, and you could just probably buy one off the shelf in like Canada or other places for like 30-40 bucks or something, or subscribe for like a month to like Levels Health or something. That really gives you, and then organize some testing in and around that time, and you could figure out the foods that can really optimize your fuel flow. So this is going back to the ketones, right? So if you had a continuous ketone monitor, you could do like a ketone tolerance test and actually consume ketones, and then you can prick your finger and measure and see how fast you clear them from your system. Someone who's not super metabolically flexible would take a longer time to clear ketones from your system, and I think they could potentially be toxic. So we see this in animals. We see this in rats and mice. If we overfeed them exogenous ketones, we can kill them. We can put them into ketoacidosis, which happens, especially in the early days when we were testing these things. And we realized very profoundly that higher is not better. And for me, and I think for athletes too, I think the sweet spot is right around, believe it or not, like 1 millimolar, maybe 1.5 to 2, and getting within that range. If you're put it into context, if your ketones are elevated in your blood 1 millimolar, that gives your brain a 10% energetic boost. So the brain is basically using about 10 millimolar of like substrate max, right? So if you were to elevate that 1 millimolar, and your glucose is under very powerful homeostatic like regulation, so it typically stays about 5. Your brain uses like a little bit of amino. If you're exercising, you make lactate. Your brain may use a little bit of lactate. But like if you bump your ketone levels up, like acetoacetate and beta hydroxybutyrate with a ketone salt to like 1 or 2, then that's giving your brain a very noticeable increase. You're also sparing glucose. So this is like a really important thing. If that's when you're on a ketogenic diet and you're optimizing fat fuel flow and you're optimizing the use of ketones as an energy source, then you're sparing the glucose to be used for that sprint. For that, you're actually it becomes glycogen sparing, and this happens in the context of a keto adaptation. And I know people loosely use this term, but what it really is that you've kind of metabolically adapted your body to using fat for energy. And you could do a variety of different tests to show this. It could be fatty acid oxidation enzymes.
The Zoom, the Zoom just froze.
There's no such thing as keto adaptation. I beg to differ and say that you can directly, measure the things I just mentioned: fatty acid oxidation enzymes, ketolytic enzymes, and ketone transporters. So, that's a process, and some athletes are already keto adapted because they exercise for 6 hours and put themselves into post-exercise ketosis. So they will adapt quite remarkably well to a high-fat diet, ketogenic diet, but it may not be optimal. So what is like possible? It's possible to train and add muscle on a ketogenic diet, but is that optimal? So that's a conversation that I've had with friends like Lane Norton, who's like, is really focused and dialed in on bodybuilding, powerlifting. But I think there's like this hybrid approach that I use that it's like, let's get the best of both worlds.
Yeah, interesting. Okay, so this has been years since I've heard this. I believe it was Ben Bickman. I was circa 2018, so he was just kind of getting in the game. And I remember somebody asked him about exogenous ketones, and he said he was speculating. He didn't really know, but and it's kind of related to something that you and I talked about a little while ago, which is like it introduces an interesting thing because ketones are made inside the body in a certain metabolic state, but you now have this situation where somebody could eat a bagel and they could have exogenous ketones. And that's very interesting because you'd never see that, from what I know, you'd never see that inside the body. Is there any issues to taking exogenous ketones of any kind, even if you're, again, like Tour de France cyclists? I know a lot of them do ketogenic diets in the off season. There's no way you're competing in the 3-week Tour de France on a low carb diet. You have to be eating thousands and thousands of calories of all the macronutrients just to not waste away. Do you see any problem with taking exogenous ketones on a mixed diet or even like a higher carbohydrate diet?
No, your body's used to these molecules anyway. So if you do consume them at a high level, for example, like it's just like if you consume, lots of sugar, your body will upregulate sugar metabolism. If you consume, exogenous ketones, it's the keto starch with electrolytes, so the ketones get released. Now there may be counter regulatory mechanisms. So yeah, it's good that you brought this up because, for example, and this is kind of why I don't like ketone esters or the liquid forms of ketones, because I've tested this myself. We see this in animals where we get side effects, right? We get, if I'm in a fasted state and I consume a large dose of a ketone ester, what happens is my ketones can rapidly go up to 3 or 4 millimolar. That causes a release of insulin, and then I exercise or whatever, and then the ketones come down, within about 2 or 3 hours, and then you're hypoketotic. But because you release the insulin, you're hypoketotic and you're also hypoglycemic. So what was happening with me is that when I would consume a large dose of, and I was very like adamant about, okay, higher is better. I'm just all about ketone esters. The salts are just like, they're not going to do anything. But I was consuming ketone esters, and like 2 hours later, I'd get like a headache. And I was like, what is going on? I started measuring my insulin, and I noticed, and now this is like we've observed this in other people and also in animal models. It's actually published that when you consume exogenous ketones and you you have a relative increase in ketones that get above 2 millimolar. You mean the delta is 2 millimolar? That triggers there's different ways that we regulate endogenous ketogenesis through ketonuria, but also a ketone-induced release of insulin. And if you consume a ketone salt, you don't get a rise in insulin because you're staying under 2 millimolar. But if you consume a ketone ester and you rapidly shoot above 2 millimolar, that's actually causing your pancreas to release some insulin, and that insulin shuts off fatty acid oxidation at the level of the muscle, but also at the level of the liver. So this is like bad in everything you think about. If you have a keto adapted athlete and you're chugging exogenous ketones, you're inhibiting fatty acid oxidation at the level of the muscle, but also more importantly at the level of the liver. So your
Yeah.
own ability to, whereas you don't see that. I don't think there's any evidence, and I've done tons of blood work on myself, dozens and dozens of insulin measurements after taking different things. And I've never observed by consuming a large dose, even 2 packets of like Keto Start, for example, and then measuring insulin, my insulin may go up from like a 3.2 to like a 3.8 or like a 4.1, but it's still way low enough that I'm actually, and that's with like 2 packets. So the take home message is that don't spike your ketone levels above like 1.5 to 2, because then you're basically shutting off fat oxidation, you're shutting off endogenous ketone production. And that's an indication, like going back to what Ben Bickman said, yeah, that is an indication of like a non-physiological state. You're rapidly putting yourself in a non-physiological state. But all the work that we've done and all the blood work would suggest that small amounts of these things within pretty robust physiological ranges, meaning like, an elevation of 1 millimolar of ketones is pretty hard to do with a ketogenic diet. And when you do that with a ketone electrolyte, the electrolytes they delay gastric absorption because your body has to make the fluid isotonic, and like things are, whereas a ketone ester, it spikes up a little bit faster. And you can basically get the best of both worlds using an exogenous ketone salt. I mean, maybe in the context of like a Tour de France athlete who's like midway through the event and then they're chugging like smaller amounts of ketone esters, but I'm of the opinion that you just don't want to use ketones or glucose or even lactate or branch. You want to have like, you want the body to use all the fuels. So you want to have like, a liquid drink that maybe has some MCTs in it that you could tolerate, electrolytes, glucose, ketones, maybe alpha L polylactate, which was used in the old Cytomax products. I'm a big fan of that. And maybe some branched chain amino acids and stuff too. Like you want to formulate, and I have lots of ideas for like different formulations that I came up with. But ketones should be part of that mix because they're such an efficient fuel. They can maintain, brain energy flow, and they just have a lot of benefits for post-exercise recovery on top of that.
Interesting. Well, I remember coming across an article a year or two ago that said like the $100 water bottle at the Tour de France, and I always thought they were using esters. And maybe in that context, like you said, maybe they're just nursing it on a 6-hour stage. Maybe they would be better just switching back over to salts and MCT, like you said, which is highly ketogenic, depending on which molecule you're actually using, what the formulation is. But maybe they're making a mistake by doing all the esters. They could save some coin as well as just doing the salts.
Yeah. Well, a ketone ester, the ones on the market are made with 1,3-butanediol, which is an alcohol. So that puts stress on the liver. There's a redox shift in the liver, and you create what's called an aldehyde when you metabolize 1,3-butanediol. And then that aldehyde is actually like a toxic intermediate that gives people a headache. That's the molecule that causes like a hangover. So you can't get around not producing that when you use a 1,3-butanediol derived ketone ester or just straight up 1,3-butanediol. So there are some molecules, like we're working with molecules that are like glycerol esters of beta hydroxybutyrate or glycerol triesters of acetoacetate. And then we have oligomers, and we have, there's all these. We got I can't tell you all the different molecules, but we have molecules that get around that problem. The simple way to do it and a palatable way to do it right now is a very balanced electrolyte formulation that delivers the beta hydroxybutyrate. And that's Keto Start is the one that I think, is the best. But I think there's a lot of potential for not like for a mix of 3 or 4 different exogenous ketones that are titrated in a way to give a maximum, like an elevation to like that 1 to like 1.5 range, and to sustain that for, you could formulate it in a way to, for example, sustain that for 6 to 8 hours. Like that would be like really cool for certain events. So you would have like an engineered exogenous ketone supplement, and then it could be, you could have other things mixed in with that too. But I think that's the future. And I think people are already doing that. I know that because I communicate with them, but I think that's the future for like commercially available products.
Wow, that's absolutely fascinating. Great way to wrap up this conversation. Dom, this has been so cool. Like I just have to pinch myself when I get to ask the world-renowned expert on ketones, what exactly are ketones? Like, it's so cool to be able to chat with you. It was great to meet you. Again, bummer that Chilla wasn't here, but we'll make sure we get her on at a different time.
Yeah,
But
for sure.
in the meantime, where can people go to find you and her as well, and her company, and connect with you guys?
Great. Thanks for asking. Yeah, we have a website, just an informational website, ketonutrition.org. So ketonutrition.org. We have a blog. Sign up for a newsletter. I put in things that I'm always testing, and we'll have, all the different like this podcast, I'll put in the keto nutrition newsletter, and we blast that out to like, I think we got maybe 15, 16,000 followers, and just starting to grow that. So ketonutrition.org, Metabolic Health Summit is is a very diverse metabolic health conference that has basic science research, has clinical research, and also has lots of networking and entrepreneurs that meet, and our sponsors really help make that happen. So Metabolic Health Summit, the Metabolic Link podcast. And both of these things are essentially products of the Metabolic Health Initiative, which is like the entity that's kind of working to further develop online education, and it's ACCME accredited. The Not only the podcast material and the content, the medical content associated with that, but the Metabolic Health Summit conference has ACCME accreditation, so you can get your medical education credits through that. And I'm trying to think what else. And then yeah, Audacious Nutrition is the company that my wife owns, and the product is Keto Start, and that's the exogenous ketone product that I use on a daily basis. Yeah, I think that's about it. But yeah, sign up for our newsletter, Keto Nutrition, and if you can't make the conference, the Metabolic Health Summit will be January 25th to 28th, 2024. If you can't make it in person, it'll be in Clearwater, Florida, which is an amazing place to be in January. There's also a virtual component that gives you access to everything, like all the recordings. You can actually like walk through the poster session. You can interact with, the speakers, and gives you full access to everything, the virtual component. But would love to see, your listeners there in person, but there's also the virtual component.
It's so much better in person. Like, it's cool
Yeah, yeah,
to listen to these things and learn from world experts like yourself, but it's so different to like actually be there and meet these people. And just like you, like I gotta like walk right up to you and chat you up with Chilla. Like, that's, you would not
yeah,
have that opportunity to talk to all these amazing experts all over the world that travel in. So I always just tell people, like, the conferences are worth it. You will not miss the time, you will not miss the money. Invest in
yeah.
yourself, go check these out. They're great, they're fantastic. So
Yeah.
that's awesome.
Yeah. You'll have access to pretty much everyone if you want to network. And then we'll have lots of sponsors there too, and they give out lots of free products. So usually most people get their money's worth just in like, free products and all the perks associated with it. So it's a great event to attend. And what better place to be than Clearwater, Florida at the, in the middle of the end of January, right? It's like perfect.
Perfect.
And the beach is amazing.
Perfect. Well, that sounds awesome. Hopefully, I'll be able to see you there this year. Dom
Yeah.
D'Agostino, this has been an amazing conversation. Thank you so very much for all the research you've done. And thank you very much for taking time out of your very, very, very busy life to be with us today. All the best to Chilla as well. But yeah, in the meantime, thank you very much for coming today.
I appreciate it, Casey. I'm grateful for being on. Thank you for allowing me to use your platform to talk about my science and research. Appreciate it.
Absolutely. Well, it's such an honor to host you. It's been an amazing conversation. And this has been another episode of Boundless Body Radio.